Well, thank you, Mr. Burt. Good to see everyone. Hope everyone's having a wonderful Sabbath day. Ghost Rose. This was an exhausting week, exciting and nail-biting and stressful, and I'm glad it's over. I'm glad we won. The city needed it, but I am glad it's over. Well, I'd like to jump into a section of verse that we may not have considered much in the past. It's not a long section of Scripture, but I think you'll see that it describes our world today more than any other point in history, really. It is regarded as the first song or poem ever recorded in the Bible, and sometimes it's referred to as the Song of the Sword. We find a man introduced in Genesis 4 and verse 18 named Lamech. And this Song of the Sword, this poem that he describes, is in Genesis 4 and verse 23. And we'll go ahead and read that, but before, I just want to give you a little bit of background. Who was this Lamech guy? What is this Song of the Sword? And why did God inspire the writers of the Bible to put it in the Bible? Well, like I said, the Song of the Sword is one of the oldest known and surviving poems or songs written in the antediluvian or pre-flood period of man's history. And we get a little bit of background about Lamech and his ancestors and his relatives in the verses before that, starting in verse 16. Lamech was a descendant of Cain. So why would God want us to know about these descendants of Cain? Well, Cain is told by God, obviously, after he kills Abel, that he's going to wander the earth and that he will not be able to live off the bounty of the earth. And Cain, it says his punishment is too much. He fears for his life, and God marks him and says, if anybody kills Cain, that he shall be avenged sevenfold. And that's important for later, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Then Cain has a son named Enoch, and he names a city after him. And then Enoch has a son, and then another son after that, and so on until Lamech, about 6 generations after Cain. We learn a little bit more in the preceding verses about Lamech's sons, how they were the originators of several types of trade. And then comes the poem with Lamech. And the story of Lamech it's only a few short verses, but what we learn from this small section of verse about the descendants of Cain provides us a glimpse into the beginning of an attitude, a way of life that we still see prevalent today. So what does it say? Let's go ahead and read. If everyone will go over to Genesis 4 and verse 23. You guys might already be there. In Genesis 4 and verse 23, the little poem or song begins, and it says, Then Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, Hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. So why is this in the Bible? Why do we see a handful of generations of Cain's descendants for just a brief moment here in the beginning of Genesis? Well, we know there's 2 ways of life, right? There's God's way of life of giving and selflessness, and then Satan's way about caring for self, a way of get. And 2 stories are beginning here in the beginning of Genesis. God's going to be working with the righteous descendants of Seth, who was Adam and Eve's 3rd son. And then we see just a little window into this opposing way of life through Cain's descendants. And you can see in this poem that Lamech is talking about that after only a few generations, how much they have strayed from God's way of life. We see in a man all the unrest and evil that comes from living apart from God. So if we break down the poem here, what was the first thing about it? Well, one of the things you notice is that Lamech took 2 wives. And this was in direct contradiction to God, in his instructions for marriage about how a man should have 1 wife. And he was obviously then, for the first thing, Lamech was spitefully disobedient to God. He's noted as the first, polygamist, and he disregarded God's instructions for marriage, and he set a precedence. If you can have 2 wives, why not 5 or 100? And, he basically made breaking God's law acceptable. The second thing he did, if you read further down and what he had done, is Lamech was merciless. He boasted proudly about killing people. about killing a man for harming him, a young man. How young are we talking about? I mean, 12? I mean, this is a terrible person. Someone harmed him. He didn't just, forgive them like you're supposed to do. He didn't take an eye for an eye. I mean, he went so far as to kill somebody who harmed him. War and killing were obviously part of his society if he's willing to brag about it. This is something that, he was used to talking about. He was perfectly willing to take a man's life like Cain did, but you can kind of see a difference between Cain and Lamech, in that Cain kind of seemed like he was a little bit remorseful about killing Abel, but by the generation of Lamech, he wasn't not only remorseful, he was boastful about it. He was proud of it. And that takes us to the third point about what we see in this poem, and that Lamech was proud of his sin. He was proud of it. He bragged about it. He went so far as to say that if killing Cain was going to be avenged sevenfold, then killing Lamech would be 77-fold. His deeds were so ruthless that God would have to mark him for being avenged 77-fold. Lamech, like so many other examples we read about in the Bible and we see in the world, he wanted glory for himself. He wanted to be considered important, separate from God. And we know where that came from. And David understood this pretty well too when he wrote in Psalms. Let's turn over to Psalms 10. I'm sure that David ran into a few people that had this type of attitude. In Psalms 10, it describes those who were wicked. In Psalms 10, verse 3, it says, "For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire. He blesses the greedy and renounces the Lord. The wicked in his proud countenance does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts." Lamech was one example of a wicked way of life that we see throughout not only the Bible, but throughout history and up to today. Quick quiz, how many people can you think of through history who had a proud countenance, who felt like they had a feeling of superiority, that they were destined for greatness? I mean, some in the Bible, Lamech, obviously Nimrod, Goliath, name a few in the Bible, but what about Alexander the Great, or Genghis Khan, or Napoleon, or Hitler? I mean, so those are some of the more well-known ones, people who had selfishness and pride and lack of mercy. All these things describe the wicked, this feeling of entitlement and feeling of more important than they actually are. And not only practicing evil, but they were relishing in it, glorifying it. How many people do we see like that nowadays that openly boast? I love sports, but definitely something's going on in football. I mean, the guys that you see, every time they make just a routine play, they stand up and, they're making all these, hooping and hollering and making all these gestures and stuff for just doing a routine play. And, I know I'm kind of dating myself here, but I remember when the Houston Oilers used to have a guy named Earl Campbell, and I know some of y'all know who that is. That guy was a truck. I mean, he could run people over, but when he got to the end zone, he didn't hoop and holler and, jump around and stuff. He dropped the ball and went back to the sideline. He did his job humbly. And we don't see that these days. Today we see people who are vain and brag about the things they do. These attitudes that Timothy described at the end time of selfishness and pride and boastfulness. Well, we know that there are those two ways of life. We know there's God's way of life and the way of the wicked. And Satan has been influencing mankind since the beginning. He wants us to sin. But we as Christians, we're striving to live God's way. That means selflessness, humility, love, and caring. Let's turn over to one more passage where Paul describes this proper attitude in Philippians in chapter 2, I'm sorry. Philippians chapter 2. And we'll start in verse 3. Philippians 2, verse 3. It says, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." Lamech wasn't doing that. His life was a life of self-interest. And it was through a line that was like that, disregarding God, disregarding anything but the spirit or the material. What can I get out of this life? But our calling is to rise above those things in the world, to be striving to remember that it's not just about us, it's about all of us. We should not be doing anything in our lives out of selfish ambition or to be seen. We should be serving one another because loving one another is God's way of life. It's not some guy bumps me so I kill him, Or not even so much to that extreme. Somebody cuts me off in traffic and I lash out at them, or somebody wrongs me in some way and I try to get revenge, or I get angry. God's looking for self-control. God's government will be run by people who are selfless and can make good decisions. An attitude like Lamech's has no place in God's government. So as we go about our daily lives, remember what we're doing here. We are building godly character. And love and outgoing concern for others is at the forefront of that character building. Let's be selfless, not selfish. Let's be humble, not boastful. Let's remember Lamech's example as something not to do.